house-elves were treated like vermin, sir. Of course, Dobby is still treated like vermin.
So, the Harry Potter reboot that no one really asked for seems to be happening, and if I were forced to say something positive about it, I would say that at least the significantly increased runtime means that all the scenes and subplots from the novels that were never adapted for screen finally get to be. However, with that being said, just because there's time for all these subplots now does not mean that all of them are worthy of adapting. In fact, when it comes to one of them in particular, I think the showrunners are better off completely ignoring it, the same way they did with the movie, and that's Hermione's side quest to liberate the House-Elves against their wishes. For context, the Hermione we got in the Harry Potter films has very few drawbacks. She always has a solution, she's the ultimate fixer every time they encounter a problem, and we rarely see her fail. When people criticize this version of Hermione, they talk about how she's much more well-rounded in the novels, with her own flaws, failures, and blind spots. And I've talked about this before on my channel as well. But one of the examples that tends to get used as evidence of her flaws is this house-elf subplot that takes up a pretty significant portion of the Goblet of Fire. And this would be completely non-controversial if the plotline only covered this part, her desire to liberate the house-elves. But that's actually not the point of the subplot. The main conflict arises from the second part, liberate the house-elves against their wishes. These house-elves that were full-on slaves, meaning owned by wizards and made to work for them, Hermione saw the injustice in that and wanted to free them, but failed because the elves themselves did not want freedom at all. And this is somehow supposed to reflect poorly on Hermione. This is somehow used as evidence of her flaws. As you can probably guess, this subplot has long been a point of contention among fans and critics alike. Is it a meaningful exploration of Hermione's character, aiding in her development, or could it perhaps be more indicative of the author's limitations, reflecting the flaws in her commentary on themes of activism and social justice? Allow me to thoroughly unpack this bizarre subplot and explain why I believe the show is better off pretending it does not exist. I want to be fair in this video, so let's start off by establishing that people are wrong to assume that the primary inspiration for the House-Elves in Harry Potter are slaves through human history. They are primarily inspired by the brownie, a household spirit from Scottish folklore. These small creatures are said to live near homes and come out at night while the owners of the house are asleep. They then work through the night assisting with chores such as cleaning and farm work. They do this without expecting pay, but the owners of the house must leave small offerings for the brownie, such as milk, bread, or cream, as tokens of gratitude. Characteristically, brownies are known to be mischievous and are often said to pull pranks. They are usually either dressed in rags or nothing at all, and if a human attempts to present them with clothing, they will leave and never return. There shouldn't be any doubt, the inspiration is clear. We are first introduced to house-elves in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets through the character Dobby. He's also small and dressed in rags. He works for the Malfoy family, primarily doing chores and not receiving payment in return. And while house-elves don't just work while wizards are asleep, they're usually pretty invisible. As for personality, well, Dobby hid letters, did the hover charm over Aunt Petunia's pudding, blocked off platform 9 3/4, all for a narrative reason, yes, but it's a play on the mischievous prankster characteristics of brownies. But the most important trait taken from brownies is the gifting of clothing. If a wizard presents their house elf with clothing, they are free to leave and never return. A fun spin on how a brownie will leave and never return when offered the same. However, this leads us to a very obvious difference between the two. The comparison with slavery didn't just come out of nowhere. Hovering over all these many similarities is a very clear divergence that can be summarized in one word: agency. If you read about brownies, they just do not give off slavery vibes at all. In fact, humans come across as way more at the mercy of brownies than the other way around. Humans are the ones that have to follow the rules if they want to maintain this special relationship. Brownies are in the power position to leave if they wish. In Potter, the dynamic is flipped. The offering of clothing breaks a magical bond that sets them free. Dobby is beyond delighted to get his freedom, and Lucius is furious because he lost a slave. With brownies, it's more like, how dare you offer me clothing? I'm offended, I'm leaving. Then there's also the fact that brownies want to do chores, whereas house-elves are magically compelled to. You might think Dobby has agency because of everything he does behind his master's back. But firstly, please remember the mental anguish and physical harm Dobby inflicted on himself for daring to help Harry, including ironing his own fingers. And secondly, Dobby was not disobeying direct commands, because that would be physically impossible. To see an attempt at what that would look like, let's take a look at Kreacher, the house elf Harry inherited after Sirius's death. Kreacher was adamant that he wouldn't serve Harry, which comes across as agency, but then the following happens.
"Give him an order," said Dumbledore. "If he has passed into your ownership, he will have to obey." "Won't! Kreacher's voice had risen to a scream. Harry could think of nothing to say except, "Kreacher, shut up!" It looked for a moment as though Kreacher was going to choke. He grabbed his throat, his mouth still working furiously, his eyes bulging. After a few seconds of frantic gulping, he threw himself face forwards onto the carpet and beat the floor with his hands and feet, giving himself over to a violent but entirely silent tantrum. "Well, that simplifies matters," said Dumbledore cheerfully.
This scene is clearly played for laughs a little bit, and that's something that's going to come up again in this video. But just observing the scene in isolation, it comes across as much more of a scene from horror. You have a sentient being who has automatically been passed down as property after the death of his master. This being so badly doesn't want to serve his new master and is trying to protest, but because he was commanded to shut up, he physically has to obey. And the act of commanding him to shut up doesn't stop what's going on in his head. Kreacher still wants to protest being handed off to this new ownership, to the point where he's grabbing at his throat and his eyes are bulging. So by taking so much inspiration from folklore, but then making this drastic change between humans and house elves, people aren't crazy to associate it closer to slavery than they do folklore. And I want to be clear that narratively, the house elves being slaves isn't wrong as a part of world building, and it isn't a problem when we're just dealing with Dobby and his character arc, because the situation is clearly laid out as being unjust, and Dobby, with the help of Harry, overcomes it and gets to be free. The problems with the storytelling show up when this injustice becomes Hermione's problem. Hermione never got to meet Dobby during her second year. Perhaps her journey into activism would have begun there if she had. Instead, the catalyst came 2 years later during the Quidditch World Cup, where she witnessed the plight of a different house elf, Winky. Winky is a female house elf who served the Barty Crouch family. Her primary duty was to care for Barty Crouch Jr., a former Death Eater who his father kept under the Imperius Curse to prevent him from running away. She did this loyally and in secret for years. However, when chaos erupts at the World Cup and Barty Crouch Jr. manages to fire a dark mark into the sky, Winky is found unconscious beside the wand used to cast the spell. What follows is a scene that's pretty upsetting. Winky insists that she didn't do it, and she's right. She wouldn't even know how to. But Barty Crouch Sr. doesn't care. To avoid associating himself with the dark mark, and because she failed to guard his son for this one moment, he frees Winky. So, a slave being freed, what's so upsetting about that? Well, unlike the joyous ending to the Chamber of Secrets, something very different happens here. Winky is horrified and absolutely devastated at the thought of freedom.
"I told her to remain in the tent, and I find that she disobeyed me. This means clothes." "No!" shrieked Winky, prostrating herself at Mr. Crouch's feet. "No, Master, not clothes! Not clothes!" It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. "But she was frightened!" Hermione burst out angrily. Mr. Crouch took a step backwards, freeing himself from contact with the elf, whom he was surveying as though she was something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. He said coldly, looking up at Hermione, "I have no use for a servant who forgets what is due to her master and to her master's reputation." Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing.
She screamed and begged not to be given freedom. This moment is crucial because it complicates the simplistic narrative of liberation that Hermione and us as the readers would initially envision for the House-Elves. Complication doesn't have to be a bad thing, and there are things I like about this different look at a house-elf receiving freedom. It is still rooted in the folklore of brownies, and in some ways it's more accurate because the offering of clothing is supposed to be a negative act that offends them. However, unlike the brownie, where remember, they are in the power position, so their choice to leave when offered clothing is agency. With Winky's reaction to receiving clothing, this is where the first cracks begin to appear in Rowling's storytelling, because by this point the dynamic has already been established as grossly uneven, unethical, and abusive. They have no agency, so having freedom be anything other than triumph over evil feels a little off. Winky's reaction suggests that some house elves are complicit in their own oppression, due to a deeply ingrained sense of duty. One so strong it lingers after the magical bond is broken. One so strong that being granted freedom causes more anguish than their life of servitude ever did. Trying to reframe enslavement as something an elf can also want for themselves can obviously get really messy really quickly. So if that's the route you want to go down, then you better dedicate portions of the rest of the story to fleshing this out properly. Because look, at this point, the storyline still hasn't completely fallen apart. It's still just cracks. Cracks that are only visible because I know how the rest of the story unfolds. But on a first read, what Winky is going through can easily be excused as a form of Stockholm Syndrome, where this psychological bond she has with her masters transcends the magical bond that made her a slave. Hence her distress. And also, just putting yourself in her shoes, this is tantamount to being sacked from the only job you've ever known, the only purpose you've ever known, in a society that doesn't seem to offer many alternatives for house elves. So understandably, the thought of freedom could be terrifying to someone in this position. It genuinely adds to the world building and makes the storytelling more complex if not every house elf has the exact same reaction to being offered clothing. It's a promising setup for a nuanced exploration of liberation where maybe Hermione, using her wit, could figure out the steps that need to be taken so that house elves can be liberated in a way that causes little harm, and takes their psychological and material state into consideration. But making it a compelling part of the story requires careful follow-through, something the narrative absolutely does not do. Instead of addressing these complexities, the story takes a messier turn. Winky's distress was not limited to the events of the World Cup. Her dismissal leads to her downward spiral of depression and alcoholism, a subplot that is played more for pity than meaningful critique.
Tears leaking down her face once more. My poor Mr. Crouch! What is he doing without Winky? He is needing me. He is needing my help. I is looking after the Crouches all my life. Oh, the shame! The shame! She buried her face in her skirt again and bawled.
Dobby manages to get Winky a job at the Hogwarts kitchens, giving her a purpose. But she was not interested in doing any work because she was still so attached to her masters. She spent her days sat on a stool by the fireplace and getting drunk. And still, even at this point, I believe the storyline was salvageable. It could both be an unequivocal critique of slavery, while also having a different, interesting arc to that of Dobby's, where freedom isn't always so simple. But I think that only comes with Winky eventually snapping out of it, recognizing that she deserves better, that she has rights and autonomy, and that freedom is a million times better than servitude, with Hermione helping her see this. No such arc happens. Winky started Hermione's journey into activism and pretty much ends it as well. The pathetic state she's in is basically there to convince both her and the readers that maybe house elves will be worse off after freedom and she should give up on being an activist. But more on this in just a second. When both Crouch Sr. and Jr. die, Winky's distress deepens further. Dumbledore requests that Madame Pomfrey does all she can to comfort her, and then that's the last we see of Winky in this book. All we are left with is seeing Winky living a life that is a million times more depressing and pathetic than the life she lived as a slave, and that's not a good thing. Apologists will claim that this doesn't necessarily mean that the story is saying she was better off being a slave, but there's nothing here that can defend that claim. Everything genuinely points to her being better off as a slave. That's what makes it so messy. Maybe if this was limited to just Winky, then it might be fine. Not every character needs to have a happy ending, and she can be a special case where freedom, due to her unique bond with her masters and her own personality, ended up being a bad thing. The problem is, Winky's arc is also the entire House Elf liberation arc summarized in one character. She's not a special case. Throughout this novel, we find out that it's Dobby who's the odd one out. The rest of the House Elves, like Winky, seem content in their chains. Winky encapsulates how the narrative undermines Hermione's activism before it even begins. So let's finally talk about SPEW. SPEW is where the subplot really starts to fall apart. Hermione, witnessing this pitiful scene at the World Cup, obviously becomes outraged. So, upon returning to Hogwarts, Hermione channels her outrage into activism. She establishes SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, with the goal of advocating for House-Elf rights. Her campaign is ambitious and multifaceted. She aims to secure fair wages, improved working conditions, and legal representation for House-Elves. So what's messy about this? On paper, this is a noble and necessary cause, and she has a plan. But in execution, this subplot is a mess, tonally inconsistent, narratively underdeveloped, and ultimately dismissive of Hermione's efforts. Beginning with how the characters react to her campaign. To spread awareness, Hermione designs badges bearing the SPEW acronym and begins recruiting members. She's met with zero enthusiasm. Harry and Ron join, but not because they've actually bought into her cause. Let's start with Ron, who straight up says,
"Hermione, open your ears," said Ron loudly. "They like it. They like being enslaved."
They like being enslaved. You will find people excuse this as a cultural difference between the two, and yes, of course, that's the case. Hermione grew up in the same world we did, where what constitutes as slavery is clear and universally condemned. Ron, on the other hand, only knows the wizarding world, where House-Elf enslavement is normalized. Therefore, he has this clear blind spot, which is consistent with his character and the broader wizarding world's apathy towards the rights of House-Elves. But instead of asking whether this is an accurate representation of how his character would think, the more important question people should be asking is the story saying he's wrong to think this way? And the most troubling aspect of this subplot is that the answer seems to be no. It doesn't actually tell us he's wrong. In fact, as this subplot continues to unfold, the story is repeatedly trying to prove him right. Right to dismiss Hermione the way he does, right to claim that they like being enslaved, and the story is repeatedly saying that Hermione is the one in the wrong. Winky was just a taste of it limited to one house-elf. The messaging becomes explicit when Hermione, frustrated by the lack of progress, decides to take more direct action. She begins knitting hats and socks and leaving them around the Gryffindor common room, hoping the house elves will pick them up and unknowingly free themselves. However, the elves are so offended by this trickery that they stop cleaning Gryffindor Tower altogether. This moment is framed as a failure on Hermione's part, with the narrative once again reiterating that she is wrong. I used to dismiss this as the story merely critiquing her methods, not her goals, but there's actually nothing in the text to suggest that Hermione should be taking a different approach. The moral of the story seems to be that Hermione just needs to give it up, listen to the house elves, and accept that they do not want freedom. A deeply bizarre conclusion for a story that ostensibly critiques systemic oppression. And I know some people will disagree with my reading of it, but I'm not backing down because let's look at Harry's reaction. He was nowhere near as harsh as Ron, but in some ways his reaction is way more disturbing. This is another opportunity for the narrative to give Hermione some backup to show us that even though things aren't going her way, the subplot isn't actually saying she's wrong. Because unlike Ron, Harry grew up in our world as well. He understands the moral implications of slavery. He also has first-hand experience with mistreatment, having been treated as a servant by the Dursleys and given old, torn-up clothes to wear. Plus, he has had the greatest exposure to the plight of house-elves through his relationship with Dobby. Given all this, Harry should be Hermione's natural ally. Instead, his reaction is one of indifference. Sure, he doesn't openly mock her efforts like Ron, and yes, he does have some more immediate concerns like the Triwizard Tournament, but much of this subplot makes Hermione feel and seem like a lunatic, that no one understands or sees the world the way she does, that no one can see how blatantly unethical it is. Harry was the perfect opportunity to make her seem less crazy, but instead his apathy reinforces the fact that she's alone in her efforts. This isolation is the narrative making her seem like less of a righteous activist and more like a naive idealist. I'm fine with Hermione's idealism and belief that she knows better than others being used as a character flaw. I know some people view this as a sort of white feminism critique, where Hermione is centering her view of the world, while neglecting and ignoring the unique perspectives and experience of the groups that, if she just listened to them, would change her approach to activism. But does it have to be in relation to this subplot? This one, where the perspective she should be accepting is that slaves like being slaves? I do not care that the house elves aren't interested. She is still 100% right. She does know better than everyone. and her supposed unrealistic, idealist goal is simply having the House-Elves work by choice rather than force, have them receive pay, have better working conditions and rights, so they can have a better life after freedom like Dobby did. If the fact that she's completely alone in this wasn't enough proof that the narrative is working against her beliefs, I have to talk about the tonal inconsistency of it as well. The plight of the House-Elves is at several points before this treated as a serious moral issue, yet when Hermione enters the picture with SPEW, the narrative often plays it for laughs. Her knitting campaign, for example, is framed as a laughable misstep rather than a creative attempt to subvert an unjust system, which, by the way, is exactly what Harry did in the Chamber of Secrets to free Dobby. This comedic treatment trivializes the very real issues Hermione is trying to address, and it reduces her cause to a running gag rather than a meaningful critique of systemic oppression. Again, this subplot is just weird. I think it would make for a more frustrating watch than a humorous one, because that's the experience when reading it. Made all the more frustrating by the lack of resolution. The subplot touching on the complexities of oppression, but ultimately shying away from offering a clear solution, is not limited to Winky. By the end of the series, Hermione's campaign has achieved nothing. House-Elves remain enslaved, and the wizarding world's attitude towards them remains unchanged. Of course, expecting Hermione to change all this on her own is ridiculous, but even on a character level, there is no clear conclusion. Her efforts are simply quietly abandoned. If it was just her methods that were the problem, Hermione is smart enough to eventually figure it out, and that would represent character growth. Instead, she lost because the narrative has decided she's wrong. So what exactly was J.K. Rowling thinking? It's hard not to read her portrayal of Hermione's campaign for House-Elf rights as a commentary on activism itself. But is she critiquing the methods of activists, the naivety of their goals, or the very idea of challenging entrenched systems of power? In my opinion, this subplot isn't just a narrative choice, it's a window into her worldview, one that has become increasingly contentious in light of her public statements on activism, particularly in relation to trans rights, where initially and on the surface it seems like she's only taking issue with the methods of the activists. But the more it goes on, it seems like she's questioning the validity of challenging societal norms altogether. Look, it's obviously not a one-to-one comparison. Hermione's activism is portrayed with a mix of admiration and condescension. Her passion and moral conviction are undeniable, and of course the series loves Hermione. Rowling herself admits that Hermione is a self-insert, so she would never reach the extent of framing her efforts with the same vitriol she has for the trans rights movement. But it is also undeniable that her campaign is repeatedly framed as naive, impractical, and worthy of mockery. The House-Elves reject her efforts, her peers dismiss her as overzealous, and the narrative itself undercuts her cause by relegating it to a secondary, almost comedic subplot. This treatment of Hermione's activism feels less like a nuanced exploration of the challenges of social change, and more like a subtle dismissal of activism itself. A dismissal that aligns troublingly with Rowling's own public critiques of modern social movement. Rowling has accused trans rights activists of erasing women's rights and silencing dissent. In both cases, Rowling positions herself as the defender of common sense and tradition, casting activists as out-of-touch ideologues who prioritize their own agendas over the needs and desires of the communities they seek to serve. The link between this and Hermione's subplot as a veiled critique of activism itself is clear enough to me. In this subplot, Hermione is portrayed as young, idealistic, and misguided, more interested in imposing her own solutions than listening to the people around her who know better. She becomes a caricature of the overzealous activist, someone out of touch with the realities of the world she seeks to change. But it doesn't work because Hermione is still right, her goals are right, her morals are right, and it's everyone else that has it wrong. So by trying to create biases and blind spots for Hermione, Rowling has inadvertently revealed her own, long before they manifested in the form they've taken in recent years. Whether intentional or not, this portrayal sends a troubling message that the fight for justice is not only impossibly difficult, but ultimately futile, and that those who dare challenge the status quo are destined to be misunderstood, ridiculed, and ignored. The narrative's dismissal of Hermione's efforts feels like a betrayal, not just of her character, but of the values the series claims to champion. And look, That's something I've definitely been feeling about the series as a whole in recent years. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Such a beautiful place to be with friends.